I still want to adventure with you.
I often compare driving a TC to riding a horse. You kind of suggest which way you want it to go most of the time, and it generally tends to listen, but you constantly have to correct it as its mind wanders off to go other ways, or sees like a nice patch of grass on the side of the road. The goal here is to keep the TC out of that patch of grass. Whoa. Excuse me. This road is a little bit rough for this car. The steering is incredibly vague. I mean, if you look, I'm always constantly correcting the steering wheel, just minor little variations, just to keep it tracking straight. And as you hit a bump, it always tries to go a slightly different direction.
Bias ply tires make it a little less straight tracking. Also, this car is very narrow, so if you have any kind of track sort of worn into the road,
it grabs all of them.
Yeah.
So suspension on this, it's got a solid axle, and the suspension basically is leaf springs, front and rear. So very, very primitive. Steering's very primitive. The steering boxes tend to have a fair amount of play. There are springs also in the end links on the steering that allow it to absorb some of the shocks of the road, but it also means that it tends to bounce around a little bit more than you would think. Some of that can be adjusted out, but that just makes the steering a little bit harsh as a driver.
And this car is definitely a very different driving experience from a modern car. You will not see footage of me driving this car. We tried that yesterday, and no, the throttle is touchy. If you let out the clutch too fast, it
surges easily.
But it's a really fun little car. I just feel like I need more practice.
So this car is really happiest at 55 and under, more under than at 55. The faster you go, it gets a little bit scary. A lot of that just has to do with the steering. It's got the power to do it. The engine's small, but it's fairly light, so it does pretty well from that end. It's mostly just an issue of what you are comfortable with as far as like the condition of the roads, how much it bounces around. When they replaced these, they replaced them with the MGTDs, which had much more modern suspension, rack and pinion steering, in a lot of ways a much, much easier car to drive. But the TC has this nice pre-war character that none of the others have. And in every way, it just makes it a fun car to run around in. That said, it's not really one that I would like drive every day. Weather equipment is really pretty poor. Yes, it has a top, but it also has side screens. With the top up, my head's basically sitting against it, even though really I'm sitting below the top of the windscreen. So it's not unacceptable, but it's really not great, especially when you get in wetter weather. But in this kind of condition, it works out really well.
It is a friendly little car. I mean, we have used it for everyday tasks. We took it through a drive-thru once.
Yep.
That was fun. Don't do that unless you have a passenger, really, because it's difficult because it's a right-hand drive car.
Yeah, and every single one of these was right-hand drive. The U.S. market was really the primary market for these, but they all were right-hand drive when they made them. They didn't really design a left-hand drive version. For a lot of people, though, this was one of the first European sports cars they ever saw. There weren't that many that had come to the United States before World War II. And really, a lot of it was like the airmen and things that bought them while in the UK and shipped them home, that you ended up really getting them coming out like this. And that's what really created the market, that and the desperate need to sell. So, sell cars outside the United States was really critical for the British auto industry after the war to make sure that they could basically fund keeping their country alive, bring some foreign money in.
And at the time, these were incredibly sporty little cars, which is one of the reasons why the airmen loved them so much.
Yeah. And frankly, most cars of that era were kind of crap to drive. They really weren't great. So some of the issues with this are things that weren't really viewed as problems in 1948 when this car was built.
It's just a normal part of driving a car.
But these are still fun to take out on backcountry roads, still fun to drive even in town. I like driving this car in town. It handles pretty well, the brakes are good. The steering is acceptable in that kind of condition. The transmission on these is actually great. It's a 4-speed, it shifts nicely, it's synchronized on everything but first gear, but you never have to touch first gear unless you're stopped. So from that end, it's pretty easy to drive. It's also really narrow. You don't really realize how narrow it is until you compare it to pretty much everything else on the road.
Yeah.
These are certainly not quiet cars to drive. You hear the transmission, you hear the engine, you hear the differential, kind of everything makes whining noises and things. And this car's in pretty good shape for the most part. It's pretty well sorted.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just not of an era where like the quiet, peaceful drive tended to be dominant. It's certainly not anything like our Bentley of about the same era, which is a absolutely quiet sports car. Or at least they call it a sports car.
Yeah.
So this was like the 4th or 5th car we added to the collection. So we've had this actually quite a while. This is a pretty early one, but it's always been one of the types of cars I've always wanted. I've always just loved these types of things with the way that the fenders are set up, the really pre-war styling. I love the huge wheels on the TCs and the earlier cars. Really, there's not really anything different between this car that they started selling in the late 40s to the car that they were building in 1939, right when World War II hit. See, I didn't have to do a huge amount to this car when I got it. I did completely rewire it, but I tend to do that to a lot of our British cars. So for the most part, it's in much the same shape as we got it. Other than at one point in time, I went around a corner and the driver's side door swung open suddenly. The latch was still attached to the body of the car, but it pulled completely free out of the wood of the door. So I did have to fix that and repair it, but the metal and all of that was fine. It's just that the screw holes had wallowed out so much. People have done modifications to these and try and improve it. I've done some to this car. I've changed out the brake drums. The original brake drums on these were actually stamped steel. And under heavy braking, it would actually change the shape of the drum while you braked. It would go from round to oval. So these are what are called Alphen drums that are on it. So they're aluminum with a steel lining, and that basically means that they don't deform at all. The aluminum is thin, so it cools them. They're really great for racing. Not necessarily something you need to do all the time. I mean, other problems with these cars is that they had a habit of breaking rear axles. Rear axles are pretty thin. The metallurgy wasn't great. So one of the other things I did with this when we did the brake drum conversion was we put in upgraded axles, upgraded rear bearings, really kind of rebuilt everything to just make it a reliable, safe driver. The only thing I don't know if it's been done on this is that the original cranks have a tendency to fracture and break as well. You can get replacement cranks that are absolutely bulletproof with like modern metallurgy, modern materials that are readily available, so it's pretty easy to rebuild the engine if your crank breaks, but it is an engine rebuild. So I don't know if it's ever been done on this car. This car is, 70 years old now, just about, or a bit over. It's not surprising that the engine's probably been rebuilt at some point, but I don't know if it was rebuilt, if it still has its original crank, what was done. So I didn't get much history with this car when I bought it. And that's something I kind of wish that I had, because it would be really good to know sort of who owned it, what had been done to it over the time that it's existed, really what condition it's in.
And how did it come to this country? Was this an airman's car that they brought here, or did it have a different story?
I mean, there's some unusual things about this car when I got it. It had a bunch of early parts that actually predate 1948 when this car was built. So some of them were actually even pre-war MG parts. So things that you wouldn't necessarily typically find on a car built in 1948.
Well, they did a model called the TV, didn't they?
Yes, and they built very, very few of them in 1939, I believe. Maybe technically 1940, but there are a few of these that were specifically modified for the US market, that they added features like these weird antenna-like front bumpers and things like that, because as you see, this car doesn't have any. They put on the turn signals that I actually did put on this car. Originally, turn signals on this car were entirely like waving your arms about. And nowadays, most people don't know arm signals to begin with. But at the same time, if you're the driver on the right side of the car, are they even going to pay attention to what you do with your arms if they don't see that you're driving it? Right now, I think most people behind us think Amy's at the wheel, as opposed to sitting here knitting. This engine is all of 1.25 liters, essentially. So tiny little motor, 4-cylinder. It puts out maybe 50 horsepower. So not a massive amount. And that's a sporting engine for this car. But, I mean, I don't know what the car weighs off the top of my head, but it's not very much.
But if you're one 1940s airman and this is your I'm just tooling around the countryside car, it was perfect for that time period. This was more a car of the people than anything else, really, that was on the road at the time. Because Bentleys and Packards, a lot of the cars that other people had were big and for the wealthy.
And these were considered affordable sports cars. So even for the Brits, you had other higher-end sports cars. You had Alvis, you had some of these other companies that built some absolutely fantastic sporting driving cars. Aston Martin, Lagonda, all of these companies. But they were expensive cars. I mean, it's a fun car. It's the kind of thing you go out and just take for the enjoyment of it. You aren't in a rush to get anywhere. You're off to do a cruise. So stay off major roads or stay in town where you can keep the speed reasonable. And you'll do just fine.
It's great for a weekend drive where you don't have to go anywhere very quickly.
Isn't always easy to do, to hold on to this point of view. But I was glad to adventure with you. Thank you for this adventure with you.